to get a sense of where the world is at today, I think you have to start with the 70s, as Ingo did in his presentation. What was going on in the 70s, in the crisis of the 70s, was that capital and capitalist states were basically saying that the kind of capitalism that existed at that point in time wasn't sustainable. That if you had a capitalism that made workers secure, that gave them social programs, that gave them confidence that progress was going to be steady, you're going to have a permanent problem. You're going to have workers who weren't going to accept authority and discipline. You were workers who, once the post-war boom was over and the economy wasn't growing as fast, weren't going to lower their expectations enough, so you'd have a profit squeeze. So the basic problem for capitalism was that this had to end. You had to have a break on what was known as the welfare state. And it's that break, it's that conviction that what you needed was to remove the working class as a barrier to capital accumulation and capital profits that gave birth to neoliberalism. Adolf Reed summarized what neoliberalism is as saying it's basically capitalism without a working class opposition. And I think that's a very good definition. So workers get frustrated at first, there's resistance to this. But what happens over time, and pretty soon, surprisingly soon, is that the resistance dies down. You have frustrated workers, but being frustrated doesn't mean that you sustain it and change things. What can also happen is that you lower your expectations. You begin to adapt to what's going on. Your incomes aren't rising, so you work longer hours. Other family members work longer hours. You go into debt. So you adjust to this. In the financial crisis, there's a delegitimation of a lot of the institutions of capitalism, from corporations to banks, to the state, to political parties. But again, knowing something and knowing that the system is rotten, Leonard Cohen's song, everybody knows, again, that doesn't in itself change anything. It doesn't necessarily change anything. So this question of, okay, everybody knows that the system stinks, everybody knows we need something else, how do we actually do it? And it's not a question just, how do you do it, if, and when. It's also a question of, what are we really talking about? It's not clear that we're all talking about the same kind of a thing when we're talking about the need for another party. And I want to use two different notions of what a party might be. One is left social democracy. It wants to go beyond social democracy. Its rhetoric is anti-capitalist. It doesn't believe that you should just be focusing on elections, but you have to be in the street as well as involved in electoral politics. So one of the questions is, if you look at this, it seems like, okay, well, left social democracy at this point in time should have a certain appeal. It sounds radical. It's not just social democratic. It's appealing to the movements. Sanders has just shown that there's a real base for doing this. You can mobilize funds. What's wrong with that option? And I think there's three things that we should that I want to raise in terms of the limits of that option. One is that the Sanders option was actually about doing it from inside. Although he was an outsider, he was doing it through traditional politics. It doesn't matter how much traditional politics has been delegitimated. If you want to be taken seriously, you still have to engage at that level of politics. So if you actually say we're going to start from scratch, that's a different ballgame. I mean, one of the things that Sanders understood, even though at the end of the 80s he had said we should completely give up on the Democratic Party, what he actually understood was that if he was going to make a run for this, he had to do it through the Democratic Party if he was going to be successful. But if you're going to start from scratch, it's a whole different ballgame. It's a whole different ballgame in terms of people actually taking you seriously, the media taking you seriously, the fact that you're going to be small, and that creates all kinds of other difficulties because people are wondering, what can you really do for us? And when elections come, you kind of seem irrelevant. The second problem is that as impressive as what Sanders did, he brought all kinds of people into politics, he changed the discourse, he put certain kinds of language on the agenda, which was terrific. He showed that you can mobilize funds in a way that none of us thought was possible. But even if you say that, the Sanders campaign was thin. And what I mean by thin is that if you're really struggling to change the world, you have to have a base in place. You have to have cells and groups in every workplace, in every community, even in the rural areas, I would argue. You have to have them everywhere. And trying to skip that, the shortcut, what electoralism is about a shortcut where you think that you can run for office. You might sneak in, you might not, depending on the situation, but there's a shortcut there. And I think it was a bit like the shortcut of Occupy. Occupy was looking for a shortcut where you have a demonstration, you take over public spaces. It didn't address the longer question about, well, how do you spread this? How do you actually use this as a base for organizing? How do you get workers to take over hospitals, administrative buildings, factories? So you really are occupying things that matter beyond the symbolism of it. And I think that what happened with Sanders is that shortcut was moved into electoral politics. Now I think that's very significant because what you had is a lot of people who were involved primarily in protest politics, beginning to see the limits of protest politics and actually thinking about, well, how do you take state power? That was a real historical move, but I think it was still at a very thin level. It wasn't about building the base for this first and seeing politics as an expression of a base that actually exists. It was a shortcut. The third problem with thinking about a left social democratic approach is that it forgets what neoliberalism is. The essence of neoliberalism, what Capital recognized in the 70s, is that there's a polarization of options. You either get more radical to the right, or you get more radical to the left. That just kind of trying to get through this with a nice welfare state wasn't going to work. And what that means is that you couldn't just put nice things on the agenda. You couldn't just say, we want jobs and we're going to do this, and we want to expand our social programs and we're going to do this. As soon as you do any of those things under capitalism, you come up against contradictions, which is that capital doesn't like it. It might not invest because it's not profitable. If they're not investing, then where's the revenue for the programs? It might leave. You had to recognize that even if what you wanted was the welfare state, things that changed so much in terms of financialization, neoliberalism, globalization, regional restructuring, a sectoral restructuring, that even to get to the welfare state, you would have to do so much more in the way of radical change and control over investment and democratizing the economy just to get the welfare state again. And I don't think that was recognized. Now, once you recognize that, you realize that just getting elected isn't going to do it. If you're really going to do all those radical things, you really would have to have a base so you could be explaining to people why you're doing things, why you're taking certain kinds of risks. So the message from it that I guess I'm trying to emphasize is the question isn't just that, well, Sanders failed and next time we have to try harder or we have to try it outside of the Democratic Party. We have to try it really differently. It's going to require a different kind of politics, not just trying harder. That socialism is essentially about trying to imagine a society that sees people and supports the idea of people as being full human beings. The point of socialism is to say we want to structure society so it's supportive of the full and mutual development of our collective capacities. You can't do that as an individual. You have to do it collectively. You want it to be universal, but you want a society that supports that kind of development of human beings. Each of those, whether you're going the left social democratic route or you're trying to do socialism, each of them has limits and each of them has contradictions. And I want to talk about the contradictions of socialism first of all. Socialism has this faith that people can be more than what they are under capitalism. But the problem that you have is that people don't just exist under capitalism, they're shaped by it. What capitalism affects is a sense of immediacy. I have to survive. I can't think about the long term because I live in the short term. So there's a sense of immediacy that's immediately there. Then there's a sense of dependency. I depend on my boss. I may not like him, but if that's what gives me a likelihood. So you've got a culture emerging that is rooted in this contradiction of not liking your boss but depending on him. And the boss becomes the embodiment of scientific knowledge, of knowledge about production, distribution, getting access to finance, what the markets are. You really are dependent. So that's the second point about capitalism. And a third point about it is how fragmented the working class is. I mean, it's fragmented by the differences between somebody making $15 an hour and somebody making $30 an hour with the pensions. It's fragmented across sectors. It's fragmented along lines of race, gender, age, etc. So you've got a fragmented working class. And we have to ask ourselves is, can we imagine this kind of a working class? Because it's not just there in the abstract. It's coming out of a particular context. Can this kind of a working class actually challenge capitalism? Can this kind of a working class even think about challenging capitalism? That another world is possible. And the point of organizing, of course, is that as an individual you can't. You have to show that collectively and through particular structures and through a long period of time this is possible. Which raises another question. If we're honest and sober about what we're saying to people when we're raising the question of socialism, well, what are we really saying? We're saying, look, if you want to change the world, you're going to have to make a lot of sacrifices. Then we tell them that, well, not only are you going to have to make a lot of sacrifices, but getting there is going to take an awfully long time. I mean, this system is pretty powerful. I'm not talking about the military. I'm just talking about its daily operations. It's going to take a long period of time. In fact, it might not even happen in your lifetime. And then to tell you the truth, I'm not even sure if it's possible. We hope it's possible, but we've got to experiment and see if it's possible. Well, those aren't great. It's not a great way to say, so do you want to join? And the problem is the only people who would likely join are people who are already socialists. So we really have this contradiction in socialism. And so what I would argue for is what we really need to do is ask, can we actually create a coherent socialist tendency across this country? Can we create something like that in every community and with links across the country? Not a party with its discipline, but a tendency. And that means that's a challenge for us. It's an open question. Can we or can't we? And are we committed to it or aren't we? And are people out there open to it or not? And what it means is all the normal things we talk about when we say we're going to organize. It means you actually say we're going to form groups in every city who are interested in talking about this, who are intrigued by talking about this, that they're going to have to figure out a way of getting resources. Because one way or the other, we're going to need organizers. You can't do this as a hobby. You want to challenge capitalism, it's going to require organizers. So we need resources, we need organizers, we need to be engaged. This isn't for having philosophical meetings about what socialism is. It's about education, but it's about education in the context of being engaged, so we actually know what's going on out there. We, as Aaron emphasized, we actually learn to be listeners. I think in terms of what the political role of this is, what are some of the key political things, aside from everything we've been involved in? I'd emphasize three things. One is we have to keep hammering this anti-capitalist theme and make it deeper. So it isn't just kind of like a stand-in for I don't like globalization or I don't like big companies, that we actually begin to explain to people what the system is. What is capitalism as a structure? And explain to people that this is a barrier to human development and to the survival of the planet. That this becomes a major thing that we do in whatever we do. Absolutely critical. The second thing is that we stop just complaining about capitalism. That the message is if you want to change it, it's going to require organizing. It's not about just, going on the air and saying this is a lousy system. That's fundamental, we have to do that. But we have to stop complaining and actually say, this is a massive organizing. And we have to be honest about how deep that organizing has to be. Not superficial, but deep. It has to be everywhere. It has to be developing all these capacities. It has to be related to all the experiences that are going on in whatever collectives we engage in. We're going to have to show people that socialism matters. So those are the three kind of political roles that I think this kind of tendency would have to be. Emphasize anti-capitalism, but deepen it. Emphasize the fact that if you're serious, you have to organize. That's the most difficult thing, but it has to be addressed. It's serious. Hopefully it can also be fun. And we have to get socialism on the agenda. A program. When the left talks about a program, it's usually not too hard to throw 2 or 3 or 4 things together. We want the expansion of social services, these collective goods, decommodify them. We want to have jobs, absolutely fundamental. The most important thing to a worker is their job. If you're not dealing with jobs, you're going to end up with workers who make sacrifices so they can keep their jobs, or who are fragmented from everybody else because all they're thinking about is survival. And we're going to have to think about a program that addresses just transitions if we're going to do the environmental thing. Now, the problem with all those programs is that they can't work in themselves. You cannot promise people broader social programs if you don't do something about this is capitalism. Social programs depends on what's happening in the private sector. You have to raise the revenue for this. So you can't just talk about it. You can't talk about promising people jobs if you don't control the economy. You can do it by saying, let's stimulate the economy, let's have more infrastructure. Yeah, but that doesn't change the basic fact that somebody else has control, and it's just going to repeat competition, inequality, insecurity. It isn't going to change those things. And even the question of infrastructure is really a class question. What are they going to do with the infrastructure? Where is it going to be? What is it going to be? And just transitions is just abstract to workers. When you tell a worker, we're going to have an environmental program and they might shut down the auto industry, but don't worry about it, we'll have a just transition. They just kind of look at you blankly. You don't have the power to promise me this. So if we're going to have a progressive program, and it's one of the differences, I think, between left social democracy and socialism, we have to be honest about this. It's actually going to require that you have more radical policies. The final thing I just want to raise around program is, we used to always talk about the relationship to the US when we talked about program. When you look at policies in the 70s, it was the waffle, it was about Canadian nationalism. You don't even hear that anymore. It is fundamental, if we're going to do anything socialist in Canada, that we have to break out of the American empire. We can't imagine we're going to be under NAFTA, and we're going to have American corporations basically running things here, and our oil is going to be shipped to the United States for their military, etc. And on the side we'll build socialism. It cannot happen. And this is a question, it might be distant, we're not even near talking about socialism, but it's one of those things you have to think about now. And there's 2 things that have to happen. One is, we actually do depend on the American class entering the same struggle. It doesn't mean we wait for them to do it, but unless the American working class is also in a struggle for this, there won't be space for us to do this. We're dependent on them actually doing this. And again, you do what you can, you try to be an example, you don't try to be ultra-left, but but there's going to be limits to what we can do. And the second thing is, you do start thinking now about, well, what would it mean if we were going to break out of the American empire? It might mean that you start with the tar sands as an example. We're not going to see our resources, not just because of the environment and the indigenous, but also because of its contribution. That these things come together, and maybe that's a fight we can take on. So we have to start thinking about, what would be the strategic things we could actually get away with? Is it resources? Is it taking over finance but leaving manufacturing until we really have the strength to do it? We'd have to think about all those things. We're not going to win it for an awfully long time. We can win battles. We'll have partial defeats. We have to keep asking always, I think this is one of the most important things, that what are we building? What are we building? Because if we're not building anything we win can be taken away again. It's got to be about what we're building, and therefore not getting disappointed. If you're always judging things in terms of what did we win in that contract? Did we get a 3% increase or not? as opposed to what do we do in that contract to build a base so that next time we can actually do something more radical. It's got to be about building, it's got to be about experimenting, it's got to be about learning. We actually don't know how to do all these things that I've just been talking about. We've got to learn them. The most important thing is, can we actually get started? Getting back to the title of this thing. Because if we don't start actually trying to build the socialist tendency as part of everything else we're doing, if we don't start building this, we can't do it. And if we do, then we're on the way. We can finally get socialism moving again. Thank you.